We want to discuss some budgetary matters, if you will, here in the United States. President Joe Biden has recently released his fiscal year 25 budget. Ironically enough, he's released it before the fiscal year 24 budget has even been passed, although that's supposedly happening at some point here today, but just gives you a sense of the dysfunction in the American political system. But it's a campaign document, and it speaks very much to the where we are right now in the politics of the country and where the president is trying to message things in order to win some votes here in the fall as he's rapidly shedding support due to his facilitation of the genocide in Gaza, among many other things. We are very honored to be joined as we get into this topic by Dr. Ben Becker, the Editor-In-Chief of Breakthrough News. Dr. Becker, thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we're in sort of a weird situation where the president has actually released a budget for essentially next year, fiscal year, so this fall, before they've even passed the budget for this year, the last several, 9 months or so. So it's kind of a complex and a weird situation. And in a way, I guess that's my first question is, what does this say about the state of the American political system that, you can't even pass a budget before the year is up? In terms of, I think, what a lot of people are looking at, which is the gridlock and stasis in Washington.
Well, as we know, the founders of the country wrote the Constitution so that Congress would basically be a place to generate useful Twitter videos and investigations of each other. I'm pretty sure we're fulfilling the letter and the spirit of the U.S. Constitution, because that's exactly what U.S. Congress currently does. They basically pass no laws. In some ways, maybe that's not such a bad thing, because the laws they pass are so terrible that you could almost argue that having a do-nothing Congress is preferable to a highly productive one at this point. But it is an indictment of where the system is as a whole, that basically each party uses its control of its one or another chamber to launch, dozens of investigations of each other and each other's donor networks and so forth. But very few laws ever get passed. The budget is supposed to be the one where, you have some sort of compromise and harmony, because nobody wants the government to shut down. Every time any budget gets passed, we're basically at the verge of a government shutdown. And they have these ongoing, continuing resolutions, which are, again, supposed to show that maybe there's a spirit of bipartisanship. But in fact, they just use these continuing resolutions to basically impose more budget cuts on the working class to keep the whole thing going, basically to maintain the status quo. So, I think that's pretty much where Congress is as a whole. The budget is the one area where you also can sort of avoid the filibuster, as Donald Trump very clearly showed when he passed massive tax cuts, 51 to 49 in the Senate. So I think there's also this indictment of the Democratic Party, which is, every time the budget comes up, it creates what it considers a wish list that it thinks is going to drive enthusiasm. And then they can turn around and say, well, the Republicans blocked us. And so there's this amazing degree of political theater surrounding every budget. The fact that you could propose a budget and it would be seen as a campaign document, and you could say that sort of uncontroversially, really says a lot. That's where we are.
I want to just because the fact that you said it's a campaign document. Biden was in New Hampshire on Monday this past week, and he's quoted in the New York Times as saying, this is the most Biden comment ever: "I'm not anti-corporation. I'm a capitalist, man. Make all the money you want. Just begin to pay your fair share in taxes." And he's always like, "Come on, man." I hate the way he talks,
so wholesome.
But all that's just, it's very wholesome. It's very, I take the Amtrak to work, man. But all that said, obviously this is a lot of campaign fluff. But one thing I find interesting, and this is not to take away from the budget, but just the fact that, I've been reading a lot throughout the week, articles about Biden struggling in the polls and trying to use the economy to get voters excited about voting for him in November. And it just doesn't seem to be working so far. And all these people are writing about it, and they're just like, gee, I don't understand. He's created all these new jobs and people are upset about him. And they'll just be like one sentence about, there's some, people who are upset about Gaza, but they'll just kind of like brush that aside as just a little thing. But it does seem to me like, yes, this is campaign fluff. Obviously, like, he's talking about things we would like to see more spending on social programs, even though he's a capitalist man. But in the backdrop of all this, there is this genocide happening that a lot of people do really care about. And it doesn't seem like this tax stuff about, and this campaign fluff is actually going to work to excite anyone when their social media feeds are just still full of images of babies torn apart by American-funded weapons for Israel.
It's not disconnected from the budget at all, Rania. I mean, when you lay it out like that, the way they were able to keep the government from closing a few days ago was to pass one of these continuing resolutions. And one of the deals between the House Republican leadership and Biden was to make sure that no additional funding in 2024 goes to the UN right to the UNRWA that serves Palestinian people. So this is the main UN agency that is feeding and housing in shelters like the majority of the 1.5 million refugees in Rafah right now. And the Biden administration makes, as its compromise, just takes it off the table. Doesn't seem like it even had any big fight about it. It speaks to exactly the point you're making, which is, you're actually enabling and deepening a genocide. You're accepting all the Israeli talking points. You're literally participating in the deliberate starvation of a whole people. And then you want to turn around and say, look, we're working with the Republicans and we're keeping the government open and we're getting things done, baby. And, like all that kind of stuff. So it's actually, it shows again how out of touch the administration is with young people. I mean, yeah, the statement, I'm a capitalist man, that's out of touch also with a large number of young people who want to see a government that is more socialist inclined, or themselves, they consider themselves socialist. But I don't think the Biden campaign has much of a future with the key demographics that it needs to motivate and inspire to win swing states, so long as the Gaza genocide continues. And I think you're right that no matter what they do, they're not going to be able to take people's eye off of this unfolding genocide that they're seeing on social media every single day. I mean, perhaps if there was a social program or something that was truly transformative in this budget, that was like a real breakthrough, maybe that would change the story and change the narrative from a political standpoint. But he doesn't even have that.
No, I think it's an important point, that you're raising because, in a bid to try to get more young voters in the past, I mean, it started at the State of the Union, but it's really been ramping up in the past week or so. There's been a push by Biden himself and the Biden administration to try to put a big focus on quote unquote affordable housing, since, most renters in most major cities who tend to be Democratic inclined voters, but even most homeowners or wannabe homeowners are struggling to find housing at a cost that's not just totally usurious. So, it's an interesting fact because, it speaks exactly to the point you're making, trying to speak to the demographics he needs. But then when you look at the budget itself, it doesn't really seem to carry through on what he's claiming he's going to do. So, I mean, talk about that if you could, and maybe also just the general framework of how these things are sort of put out there sort of in the ether. Like, there is an affordable housing crisis and I'm doing X, but not really addressing whether X is even addressing the crisis.
Yeah, exactly. So, for instance, the big thing that he wants to campaign on this week is all about housing, as you're saying. And it's one of the biggest affordable housing budgets in history, blah, blah, blah. Similar to kind of what they did a few years ago with the biggest climate change bill in history, but, not nearly enough to actually have a transformative impact on carbon emissions or the transition to renewable energies. So he always hits this sweet spot where he can sort of propose enough money to drive the Republicans crazy as if he's doing something radical, and then do not nearly enough to meet the scale of the problem or inspire enthusiasm for his own base. It's really emblematic of the entire Democratic Party approach. But for instance, if they propose $33 billion in repairs for public housing, well, the backlog of repairs for public housing are by a magnitude 2 or 3 times greater than that already. So okay, the greatest affordable housing fix in history means that 1/3 of the people with urgent repairs needed in public housing will get their stuff fixed in the next 10 years. Really? Instead of a massive investment in public housing, almost no new public housing has been built in the country in decades. And so the way that they try to deal with the housing problem, which is, I would say, the number one problem that people are facing. The rent still is too damn high. and and those who are trying to buy homes are finding it extremely difficult to do so. You have hedge funds just buying up all the private single-family houses all over the country. He's not waging war against the hedge funds, for instance, or imposing regulations. What he's saying is we're going to, again, sort of create incentives for first-time home buyers. It's all sort of out of the toolkit of the historical sort of pro-capitalist housing approach, or you give some vouchers, but even the vouchers are being cut. And the native reservations in areas, vouchers are actually being cut. So when you drill into the details of these things, there's actually a mixture of cuts and increases, but nothing, again, is really transformative. There's nothing about rent control at a federal level. There's nothing about, again, building new housing that is public housing. Because ultimately, if you want to take the power away from the big developers and the landlords who are jacking up the rents and the home prices, you have to have a counterpoint. You know, in healthcare, they say the public option. Well, there is actually no housing public option. Everything has to go through the landlords and developers. So that would be a big change. And, you know, it's, again, not meeting the scale of the problem. It's par for the course. It reminds me a lot of the infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better bill and all those different bills from a few years ago. This one is actually promising even less than those bills did. Remember in 2021, when Biden came in, he said, we're going to have, universal child care. We're going to relieve college debt, a whole suite of things, making the child tax credit permanent. We're going to raise the taxes on the very wealthy up, back to where they were before the Trump tax cuts. None of that happened. And basically, he attacked the progressives in his own party. He made them give it up. They very willingly gave up those same issues. They negotiated it away. They compromised it away. They whittled it down. By the time you got to the end of the process, there was very little of all those promises left, almost none. And yet then they still try to turn around and say they've had some historic presidency. So, in a way, we're at the very beginning of the exact same process playing out in 2024. But the promises they're making at the beginning of 2024 are worse and even less efficient than the promises they made at the beginning of 2021, at the beginning of his presidency. And I guess they're expecting we're all just going to forget about that.
And this is like the ongoing problem with Democrats too, among many others, because they start at this position of like basically having conceded, assuming Democrats actually stand for what they say they stand for, which I know they don't. But let's like be generous and give them that, right? Whereas Republicans are actually radical and not a good way. Like they're talking about right now, they've always talked about this, but now you have them talking about it again, increasing the retirement age for Social Security, for example, and talking about cuts to Social Security. So it's like you have this insane radical party that's like, yeah, let's cut everything and get rid of everybody's rights. And then the response from Democrats is so meager. It's like they're asking for even less than when they started with, and they don't even mean anything they're asking for. It's a recipe for moving further to the right on everything, is it not?
It is. And even if the population is moving to the left on a lot of key issues, the policies continue to move to the right. And Obama, of course, famously did this too with his budget sequester when he was in office, that basically a right-wing group can sort of force the Republican Party to take a hard line. And the Democrats are very willingly sort of allow the historic advances of the working class, whether it be Social Security, Medicare, and so forth, to be chipped away at. So again, when the Republicans put it forward and Biden says, we're going to fight the Republicans, we're going to stop them, we're going to protect Social Security. Well, no one can really believe that because they've never fought for it before and they have let it be chipped away at. And so I think it is the same pattern again. And yet the one thing they all agree on, I don't even have to say it. I'm sure all our viewers at home are yelling at the screen, war, war, war. They're going to agree again on over $100 billion for, if you combine Gaza, basically Israeli genocide of the Palestinian people, Ukraine war funding, and then border security. And of course, they disagree about the tactics, but they both agree that you need massive amounts of new militarization of the border, more border agents, more border technology, weapons, all that stuff, mass detention. They're both sort of competing for who can be the furthest to the right on these issues, while both sort of slinging mud at each other for for weakening the border. So, you'd think that these were the main priorities of the US people if you were to look at a budget. When you think about a budget, you really think about your priorities. Like if you pulled out my bank statement and I spent, 85% of the time going out to restaurants, you would think, well, this guy's seriously a foodie or whatever. Like that's what he cares about. Or if you spend half your time going on ski trips, you're obviously a ski enthusiast. So if you look at the US budget, it's obvious these people are just war enthusiasts. They're weapons enthusiasts, and they are border security demagogues to boot. And basically, that's the one thing that they're going to unite around. They're each going to actually say that the other side is weakening, but they're both really working hand in glove with the weapons contractors. And I think we should just note, whenever we talk about the military budget, the official budget request is now up to $850 billion. And that's basically through proxy wars and U.S. Military bases that are all across the world. But if the U.S. were to directly engage in these wars itself and put its own personnel on the line, have ground invasions, the type of war that would come if, for instance, there were a war against Russia and China, we'd be talking about many trillions more. And then there have been studies from the Monthly Review and other organizations that say that there's really another $700 billion in military spending that's hidden in different agencies and classified differently. So the actual military and war budget is up to around 1.5 trillion already. So again, if we're looking at what a government's priorities are assessed on its budget, it is not public housing, despite the campaign promises of Joe Biden. It is not healthcare. It is not food or renewable energy. It's war, and it's the military, and that's despite huge numbers of people in both parties, blue and red states, saying they'd prefer a transition to a peace economy where your tax dollars actually go to your own communities rather than the weapons of destruction.
No, very, very well taken point, and a notable point as we consider the Ukraine war. That was one of the biggest fears that U.S. war planners had at the end of the Cold War, was that Americans would not want to support endless war against Russia and, in fact, would want to spend it on priorities at home. So think about that when you hear all the fear-mongering about Russia. But nonetheless, we'll have to keep covering as things keep going, as they bumble and stumble along throughout the campaign. Happy, as always, to have you with us, Dr. Ben Becker, the Editor-in-Chief of Breakthrough News. Wow.